Okay, everybody, welcome to this episode of the show. As ever, I'm delighted to be joined by my friend and colleague and in-house analyst at the MirYam Institute, Yaakov Lappin. And we're recording this on Sunday, January the 19th, 2025, on what has turned out to be a momentous day in the history of the Jewish people and certainly in the history of this war. Namely, we have witnessed the release of 3 female hostages from the Gaza Strip who have now been reunited with their loved ones inside the state of Israel. Those 3 hostages are Romi Gonen, age 24, Emily Damari, age 28, and Doron Steinbrecher, age 31, all 3 of whom were taken into Hamas captivity during the Hamas massacre on October 7th, 2023, and have been there ever since. Now, this is a result of a deal that has extracted an enormous price from Israel and from the Israeli people in Tyre. And the terms of the deal are such that anybody who cares for the state of Israel and the future of the state of Israel is going to struggle to wrestle with those terms. I am certainly one such individual. I'm not comfortable with those terms. But that does not in any way diminish the joy that I feel, the celebration that I had and continue to have as I saw the return of those 3 female hostages from inside the Gaza Strip today. And so, Yaakov, thank you very much for being with me. I really appreciate you working with me to bring this really quite rapid response to this day. And I'd like to go through just a number of subjects. We'll get into this in more detail in our podcast, perhaps later this week or even next week. But just to begin, I'd like to get your view on the images that you saw when we first were able to confirm, by way of the TV reporting that was going on from inside Gaza, that these 3 young women, Romi, Emily, and Doron, were alive.
Well, I think, what we saw with those tens of Hamas terrorist gunmen basically stage managing what was really a media event for them. And their main goal, in my view, was to signal to the people of Gaza that Hamas is on its feet, that it remains strong, that it survived 15 months of war with the regional superpower. And this was a demonstration of strength. Now, the thing is that this was actually propaganda, because when you look at what Hamas is today compared to what it was a year and a half ago, this is a very badly wounded animal. And we can go into why I say that if you like, but the bottom line for this stage of the conversation is that Hamas stage managed a propaganda video. It used this event to try and signal to the Gazan people that it is here, that it is not going anywhere, and that they better not start thinking about a post-Hamas future. And they did that effectively. They've always been good at propaganda, and they used it as psychological warfare against the Israeli people. They very much benefit and enjoy from these images of gunmen controlling Israeli civilians and pretending to treat them well. Of course, that's sort of the propaganda for international audiences, for anybody who's naive enough to believe that. So look, at the end of the day, what we saw was Hamas using this as a signal, and the main target audience, in my view, was the people of Gaza. And the signal is, we are here, we're going nowhere, our regime is coming back. Don't even think about cooperating with any initiatives of a post-Hamas future. And another thing that we've heard recently, in recent days, has been executions of Gazans suspected of collaborating with Israel. This is part of the same message, the same brutal message that Hamas is sending. So that's the first thing I thought when I saw those images. And the next thing I thought when I saw the 3 young women.
Yaakov, I'm just going to ask you to please stay in frame.
Stay
You're
in frame.
drifting down and out of the frame. I think this
It's
is the last time I'm going to appeal to you to do that. I want you to stay in frame. So if you need to move your chair back, go ahead and do it. But
okay.
please stay in frame because it's just very important for those who are going to be watching this. Thank you. Carry on.
No worries. Okay, and obviously the next thing I thought was when I saw the 3 hostages emerge from the vehicle was, thank God they're on their feet. Thank God that they haven't been severely wounded, that their healthy enough to get out of that vehicle, and you can see when a person moves that they're not in dire physical condition. That doesn't mean that they don't have serious injuries that will be discovered during the hospital assessment. And we haven't begun to talk about the psychological trauma, which obviously all three of them will have to deal with for years to come. But I really felt just huge relief at seeing that these women are relatively uninjured, and that they have every chance of being reborn. I view it as a rebirth. Every hostage that comes out of Gaza, it looks to me like a rebirth. And when I saw them in their mother's arms, I really felt like I was looking at people who had a second chance of life. And that was incredibly moving. And I think that's just a universal feeling that, all of us Israelis and Jews around the world as well likely feel when they see those images, and any other human being, with a normal, emotional makeup. So, as you said, there are conflicting things going on here. But one thing I would argue is that there is an argument to be made that this release does serve Israeli security. It also serves Israeli security. And the argument that I would make on that front is that we need to start healing in our society. In my view, there's no question that stage two of this war is coming. And what we need to do is get as many hostages out as possible and start healing the internal rift, which has become far too dangerous in Israel. And I think that's going to contribute to our societal unity and resilience, and that will contribute to national security. So that part of the, let's say, the national ability to come together during this moment, I think that's going to be very beneficial, because I think uh, the second round of this war is not far. It's not far away. I don't believe in a stage two. I'm very skeptical that it's going to happen.
You're
So I think
referring now to stage two of the hostage release deal / ceasefire arrangement. You don't believe that the second stage is going to come about.
I'm extremely skeptical that it's going to come about, because when you examine Hamas's, ideological DNA and their jihadist fundamentalist nature, I mean, what are we talking about? Demilitarization, letting go of all the hostages, which is their main insurance policy. I can't imagine Hamas doing that. And I think that Israel has got to use this time right now to recalibrate and to strategize about how the second round of this war is going to look like. And the thing that's important to me is that we don't repeat what I view as our greatest mistake in Gaza in this war, and that is the failure to set up a military administration in the areas that we will end up going back into in the Gaza Strip. That will be the thing that will destroy Hamas's regime, and we have got to do it this time. I really hope that the government overcomes any objections from the military and pushes that forward. So
And
those are
and so
some of the initial thoughts.
you're referring to the second stage of the deal, which so that everybody understands,
Yeah.
phase one is going to last for 42 days. It will be a dreadful 42 days, because each week along the course of that period, 3 to 4 hostages are slated to be released back to Israel by Hamas. But we will not receive the details of which hostages those are until 24 hours prior to their actual release and return. And we will not know the state in which those hostages are, including whether or not they are alive. That information is not going to be known. So the ongoing anguish and torment among the family members of the hostages is going to endure and even intensify. What Hamas has done is it's essentially, Yaakov, thrust Israel into the most macabre, profane, awful lottery, essentially, to wait and see whose number is going to come up, who is going to be selected in order to be returned home during this 42-day period. And at point 16, in terms of the days, on the 16th day, we are supposed to, in Israel, begin negotiations with Hamas as to what the second stage is going to look like and to how it will be implemented. So this is a dreadful situation in those terms. By the way, those are not the only dreadful terms. I'm going to turn to some of the aspects of the military and the Israel Defense Forces and where they are deployed and where they'll be redeployed to in due course. But I actually want to tell you, I take a very, very different view to the view that you just described. I actually think that Hamas is in charge. I don't think that it's a propaganda move. I think that anybody who saw the images today could at least consider the idea that they are powerful, they are wielding their powers of intimidation, as you alluded to with what you just said. But I don't think that that extends only so far as being a propaganda tool. I think that they are going to reconstitute themselves if they are allowed to. I think that they are still in charge of the Gaza Strip. I think that they are still wielding the Kalashnikovs and they are still wielding the guns. And as long as that is the situation, they remain a very serious threat to Israelis on the other side of the border inside the state of Israel, particularly when we analyze, and as I said, we'll do that in due course, the redistribution and redeployment of our forces and the proximity of Hamas to our border with them. So that's the first thing that I disagree with you about. I think that they are a potent and very worrying presence there inside the Gaza Strip. Granted, they are not functioning as a terror army. Granted, the vast majority of their battalions have been destroyed and decimated by the Israel Defense Forces. But nobody can tell me that we ought not to be worried by the sight of them arriving, as you said, in their dozens on the very same tracks and pickup trucks that we saw them use with such murderous effect on October the 7th as they rampaged through southern Israel and through the towns such as Sderot. Nobody, I don't think, can convince me, at the very least, that this is something that should be viewed only as a propaganda effort on the part of Hamas. I think that's the reality, and I think that we're going to be very, very hard-pressed to change that reality if we see the terms of the deal implemented by the Israeli side as they are supposed to be. The second thing that greatly troubled me, Yaakov, and I'd really love to get your thoughts here, is I watched very closely the transfer of the 3 female hostages from one vehicle of the Red Cross to the other vehicle of the Red Cross. Did you see those images? Are you familiar?
Yeah.
Okay. So I watched that very, very closely, and I looked on in absolute horror. I think that was probably the most perilous walk ever undertaken by anyone in the history of mankind. And I'm not just saying that. I'm not trying to be hyperbolic when I say it. I looked on as 3 completely, totally, and utterly vulnerable, weakened female hostages, Israelis, moved from one vehicle to the other, a short distance, granted, but from one vehicle to the other, surrounded by throngs, hundreds and thousands of Gazans who were very, very close indeed to those cars, and they were being held back only by essentially a picket line of Hamas terrorists clad in black with the trademark green bandanas around their head, looking like absolute thugs, waving their Kalashnikovs in the air. And I think back to the images of, for example, the lynching of Gaddafi in Libya. Once a crowd of that size and scale decides that it wants to have at a given target, very, very little can get in its way. And I'm quite frankly amazed that they were effectively held at bay and that we didn't see scenes of violence and blood spilling, because I don't believe that those Hamas gunmen, had the crowd decided otherwise, would have been able to hold them back if the crowd had decided to attack and to try and lynch these 3 female hostages. And what worries me most about that, Yaakov, is I do not believe for a moment that the crowd will remain pacified, isn't the right word, restrained, held back from coming proximate to the hostages. I don't think that will be the case when and if the time comes that the hostages being transferred from vehicle to vehicle are our male soldiers, our male hostages, men of age between 18 and 50 approximately, as Hamas determines them to be technically enemy combatants. I'm very, very concerned about a lynch taking place. And to put this into somewhat more relatable terms, it looked rather like when celebrities are shuttled out from restaurants in Hollywood and crowds of paparazzi are trying to get to them, or crowds of the general public are trying to get to them, and their bodyguards are just able to sort of shuttle them into the awaiting vehicle. obviously with much more sinister implications in this particular case. And I actually contacted Yaakov, a family member of one of the male hostages who is still inside the Gaza Strip. And I said to him, listen, you need to be in touch directly with Gal Hirsch or whomever it is who's your point person on this issue, because obviously they're being escorted by somebody representing the Israeli government and the defense establishment who briefs them, and to make sure that the crowds are not allowed as close to your brother if and when his time comes, please God, to be released, as they were allowed to be in the case of these three female hostages. What do you think about that particular issue and challenge?
So, okay, let me address some of the points you've made. I'll start with the most recent, and then I'll work a little bit back because I had some
Thank
thoughts.
you.
But I think that this was largely this scene was engineered by Hamas to make these terrorists look like they're protecting them. It looks good for them, especially in the Western media. Did you see that they received these bags, these farewell
Yes, I did.
bags,
I did see this. They were given essentially what I think Americans call goodie bags, right?
goodie bags?
Or farewell bags with all
Yeah,
sorts of mementos in them from their time in captivity.
exactly. So I think the whole scene was engineered to basically cause the West to try and get erase the reality that these women were held in Hamas's dungeons for 15 months after being brutally kidnapped, and one of them was seriously injured during the 7th of October. And the whole thing was designed to make Hamas look like some sort of, noble caretakers, and now they're protecting them against the crowd. I wouldn't be surprised if the entire scene was engineered. And again, I think it's, Hamas knows how to message multiple audiences at the same time. They've always had that ability. They can message Gazans, show them strength. They can message Israel with psychological terrorism, and they can message the West all at the same time simultaneously. And here, I think Hamas must not be underestimated in its propaganda abilities. Now, look, regarding what you were saying about its strength and not strength, I don't actually think that we're disagreeing because I am making a very big difference between its current strength and its future strength. I view Hamas, I often used the medical analogy, as a tumor, and the tumor obviously still exists. I think that it is weakened. I think it is smaller, but if it's left alone, it's obvious to me that it's going to grow right back. And I think in a moment we'll talk about how that might happen. Northern Gaza will be the first place where I think we need to watch out for Hamas re-entrenching itself. But there's no question in my mind that if it's allowed to grow back, it will become a lethal, a terrible threat, not only to southern Israel, but actually to our very continuity, because the conclusion by the entire region, the tailwind this will provide to terrorists in Judea and Samaria, to what's left of the Iranian axis, to new Islamist forces in Syria, to Turkey, the message will be very bad. We cannot allow that to happen. And so I think the future, if we don't act, is going to be extremely dangerous. If we do act, and my assumption is that we will, I think that we have an opportunity here to finish what we started. But as of now, as of today, I also don't want to play along with Hamas's propaganda. And so I'm going to point out that Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, according to most assessments so far, they have lost at least 20,000 armed terrorists. They've lost their senior command structure. They've lost many of their mid-ranking commanders. All of the dual-use infrastructure, the civilian areas that they thought would hold the IDF off, that failed as a strategy. Their tunnel strategy failed. And the level of damage they have absorbed is massive, and we're not even mentioning the injuries. I'm assuming that there are well over 10,000 of them injured. So most of their fighting force has been neutralized by the IDF, and this is while the IDF has been stretched on at least two fronts from a ground forces perspective, if not three, if we're not including Judea and Samaria, then Lebanon as well. So at the end of the day, I think the military achievements are very, very significant, but I completely agree with you about what might happen if we don't follow through. That's the first major point I would say. And the second thing is I think that the key to defeating Hamas and achieving the other war goals is this whole business of aid distribution and an Israeli military administration in the Gaza Strip. We have shied away from this. The general staff has done everything to basically force the government not to do this, and the fact that general staff can force the government to do or not do something is its own problem. We've talked about this in the past. The very unhealthy relationship between the military echelon and the political. I mean, I think that that has got to change. That, and if that means, getting rid of the chief of staff, forcing him out, then I think that that's what needs to happen. Because if, again, I can't emphasize this enough, if in stage two of this war, which I believe will follow this stage of the ceasefire, if Israel does not set up a military administration in the areas that it captures, the future areas that it captures, we are going to be stuck in this loop forever. There's no way around it. And that's something I have concluded a long time ago.
So you've spoken about that. I'll just say my last word on this issue of the presence of Hamas, while completely understanding that there's a possibility, we don't know, but there's a possibility that all of this was carefully stage managed. A madding crowd that decides it over an ever increasing amount of time as it continues to discover the lack of the buildings that they vacated when they left northern Gaza in order to move to the safe zones that the IDF designated for them, when they realize the degree and the extent of the distraction inside northern Gaza, which I have seen many, many times for a sustained period of time during the course of my service. I emphasize for everybody listening, as extensive as that damage may be, it is equally justified, and it is wholly the fault of Hamas that not only fought out from within civilian areas inside the Gaza Strip, but established its infrastructure within civilian areas inside the Gaza Strip, and that forced the IDF to come into those very areas in order to fight back against the atrocity of October the 7th. All of that is true, but as you see the Gazan population returning there, confronting that reality, I think that it's going to be very, very difficult to restrain how that population behaves and to essentially continue with public order to any sensible or reasonable degree. I don't think that that is known. And so if it is orchestrated, it's a very, very dangerous game that Hamas is playing.
I agree.
And at no point do I feel comfortable with the idea that something is orchestrated. Therefore, we need not worry about it, which is not, I understand your opinion. You're
No.
obviously concerned about it as well. But I really, really felt it to be of high importance to convey my concerns to the hostage family member that I contacted this afternoon. And he shared the very same concern, incidentally. As soon as I mentioned it to him, he said that he was deeply, deeply worried by the images that he saw. He questioned whether or not the objection or the concern would be taken seriously by the people that he would report it to, which is a different topic. But I do not trust Hamas to hold under control such a massive, massive population, restive population, currently in many cases without their homes, where food is running short, when they become confronted by the images, if that should happen, of young Israeli men fresh out of their service in the Israeli military. And I think that those civilians in Gaza will draw a very short nexus between the distraction by which they're surrounded and the soldiers or former soldiers that they're looking at in these convoys of the Red Cross. To me, it's a very, very dangerous game. I want to now move to a subject adjacent to what we've just spoken about, which is the redeployment of forces of the Israel Defense Forces inside the Gaza Strip. Now, I was doing media yesterday, and I was expressing to the various outlets that were interviewing me that Prime Minister Netanyahu has made it very, very clear in repeated public statements that the Israeli media reports that the IDF is going to be withdrawing from the Philadelphia corridor, those are not reliable reports, and that he not only intends to have the IDF remain along the Philadelphia corridor, remember that's the area adjacent to the border between southern Gaza and the northern Sinai Peninsula. Not only does he want Israeli Defense Forces troops to remain there, but he's also speaking about increasing the IDF presence in that area. On the other hand, there is an open conversation about the IDF withdrawing from the Netzarim corridor. And for everybody listening, once again, the Netzarim corridor is basically the artery that runs from east to West Gaza. It bifurcates north from South Gaza, and it's through that corridor, or it's that corridor that the returning Gazans must traverse in order to return to their homes, which are basically non-existent now, but where their
Right.
homes were in the northern Gaza Strip. Now, this obviously creates reassurance on the one hand to some degree, namely the retention of military responsibility over the Philadelphia corridor. It also creates enormous concerns when it comes to the reduction of IDF forces along the Netzarim corridor. And I want to read how you put it so well and so succinctly in your recent reporting. And you have expressed the following, quote, during the first stage of the Israel-Hamas ceasefire agreement that took effect on Sunday, that's today, the Israel Defense Forces is to retain control of the Philadelphia corridor, separating Egypt from Gaza and preventing mass weapons smuggling. And you go on to say, Yaakov, well, this is welcome news. The IDF is also set to carry out a staged withdrawal from the Netzarim corridor in northern Gaza. And the cabinet has opted to outsource security checkpoint screening of Gazans moving into the north of the Strip to an American company. Finally, the last part that I want to quote, this raises serious security and operational concerns, you go on, since the ability of any U.S. contractor to disrupt Hamas's obvious intentions to re-entrench itself in Jabalia, Bet Lahia, and Bet Hanun. These are all areas for our listeners that are north of the Netzarim corridor, is highly doubtful, particularly without the IDF on the ground nearby. Now, that reporting can be seen. It's online on jns.org for anybody who wants to read it. And I want to get your view on this redistribution of our forces. Let's go one by one. Start with the Philadelphia
thank you for
corridor.
that excerpt. So look, so the 99th Division, which was running Netzarim corridor where you served, is leaving. It's leaving Netzarim corridor. And that's very dramatic because it's obvious that Hamas is going to rush back in, even if many of the areas are utterly devastated. They are going to set up shop very quickly, reestablish their command posts. And basically what this means is that Hamas is moving back into northern Gaza. And that's one of the reasons why, I believe that this has got to be temporary, because otherwise, not only have, we fought in such a focused, determined and brave manner for the soldiers who did the fighting in Jabalia, and all these areas that you've just read, going house to house, street to street, alley to alley, dealing with booby traps, dealing with newly recruited Hamas terrorists, losing far too many casualties along the way. All this was to happen so that Hamas is going to move back into northern Gaza. That cannot be. So this has got to be temporary, and this was, I think, the biggest price that Israel has paid, the biggest price the Prime Minister Netanyahu has agreed to, is the withdrawal of the IDF from northern Gaza. Now, what's going to happen is that the 162nd Division, which is operating north of Netzarim corridor, it's going to pull back to the perimeter, which is about a kilometer deep into Gaza. And the Gaza Division.
Yaakov, let's just define perimeter for the people listening. The perimeter is this area to the north and the east of the Gaza Strip that is essentially going to be, for want of a more elegant phrase, a dead zone. And anybody who crosses into that area is going to end up exactly that. They're going to end up dead. The rules of engagement are to eliminate and take out anything that starts moving in that area. It's to be determined and viewed as a threat and promptly dispatched by the members of the IDF who will be operating from the Israeli side of that perimeter or the border.
100%. And what that means essentially is that the IDF is going to encircle Gaza and in the south. So yes, the IDF will remain in Philadelphia corridor, but in all the other areas that it's been operating in, it's going to withdraw back to the perimeter. Now we're talking about the Gaza Division, which is the 143rd Division. That's been very active in central and southern Gaza. They're pulling back to the perimeter you've just described. The perimeter itself has virtually no structures left in it, so it's much easier to detect terrorists who are approaching under the guise of civilians. So basically, what the cabinet is saying is, look, for the next 42 days, we are going to encircle Gaza. We've got the Philadelphia corridor covered. We've got the perimeter covered along the rest of Gaza. And that means that nothing can be smuggled in. That's That's true, but that doesn't prevent Hamas from retaking northern Gaza. And that's what they're going to try and do. And that's why, again, this has got to be a temporary issue because if it isn't, what have we spent, the past 8 months fighting for in northern Gaza? It would be, it would be utterly bizarre if we gave up the two stated war goals alongside the release of the hostages, if we just gave them up because of a second stage. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't add up. So that's why another reason why I'm convinced that we will be moving back into these areas. And that's essentially the redeployment. You're seeing the divisions come back out. Now, this outsourcing of the security checkpoints to a U.S. company, if the IDF was in the area, that could somehow, make sense because
Hold
if
on,
they,
Yaakov. Let's go to that in a moment because I
yeah,
really want people to see this for what it is. You've conflated the two, which actually is not what I wanted, but I don't think you heard what because we were speaking over each other. So you've spoken about the Netzarim corridor and where you think that is obviously an inherently flawed situation.
yeah.
But now before you go to the Americans, I want you just to talk about your view with regards to the Philadelphia corridor. You mentioned it in passing just now, but talk to us in a little bit more detail about how you see troop deployments there and the advantages or the positives of that versus the negatives that we're seeing with regard to the Netzarim corridor into the northern part of the Gaza Strip.
Right. So the
And then we'll
IDF,
and then we'll come to the Americans.
okay, the IDF is remaining on Philadelphia corridors, and that means that Israel is retaining control over the border between Gaza and Egypt. That is critical because it's going to stop weapon smuggling from the Sinai into Gaza. It's going to stop the movement of terrorists back and forth, overground and underground. And it's probably the biggest achievement that Netanyahu can boast of because throughout this entire war, Hamas has been demanding a full IDF withdrawal from the Gaza Strip. And what it has achieved is essentially a partial withdrawal, not a full withdrawal. So I was actually very surprised to hear about Netzarim corridor, the northern part, the northern withdrawal. This surprised me, but I was pleased to hear that the cabinet stood firm regarding Philadelphia because there was massive pressure to vacate both. And the significance, again, it's about arms smuggling, it's about terrorists, and it's about Israel making it clear that it's not going to give up control between the only access point that Gaza has to the outside world that does not include Israel itself, and that's the Egyptian border. We cannot trust anybody but ourselves to ensure that this border is not being used for smuggling. And if Hamas starts to rebuild its terrorist infrastructure, the Philadelphia corridor will be the main instrument for it to do that. So this is critical. This is absolutely critical. Without this, it would really be, I think, a defeat, for Israel if we had left Philadelphia corridor. So it's absolutely critical that the
And
IDF
you
stays
don't
there.
see the IDF withdrawing from the Philadelphia corridor or reducing its forces down to a small force that will look after the Rafah crossing, for example, which is not the entirety of the Philadelphia corridor in stage two as part of the ongoing negotiations that we spoke about at the top of this program. You don't see that happening.
So I did push IDF sources on that in recent days, and they were evasive. First of all, they were
You
evasive,
see, Jakob, you see?
and they
You see,
said,
this is what I'm driving at with my discomfort with this whole situation. But I'll come back in fuller form in a moment. Go on.
no problem. Yeah, they were evasive, and they said, look, you need to speak to the government about this because it's their decision. First of all, that's true. They're right. This is a government decision. It's not their decision. Um, I don't think stage two is going to happen. This is the thing. I really doubt stage two is going to happen. So if it happens, yeah, the IDF will leave Philadelphia corridor and it will basically withdraw from the Gaza Strip. Otherwise, there will be no stage two. I don't see that happening. It just doesn't make any sense because it would be basically a statement saying Israel is giving up on two out of the three war goals. It doesn't add up to me. Maybe you see things differently, but from everything that I've seen out of Prime Minister Netanyahu, the cabinet, even the IDF general staff, which is saying this war is going to continue, and obviously we're coming back into Gaza. None of that tallies up with a stage two. So I don't think it's going to happen. I really believe that the IDF is going to be moving back into Gaza quite soon after the end of stage one. I could be wrong, but this is my assessment. This is my belief. And I think that Hamas, it will be fairly easy to find a good reason to do that because Hamas is not going to demilitarize, right? One of the things that Prime Minister Netanyahu has been saying over and over again is that he has got a U.S. commitment from both the outgoing Biden administration and the incoming Trump administration saying that if Hamas refuses to comply with some very basic demands about the future of Gaza, the Americans will have the Americans will provide full backing for Israel to re-enter the war. Now, that itself, by the way, raises some questions. How much faith should we put in these letters? We do have a president coming in who's very fond of making deals and taking credit for deals. So my view is this, to make things simple, my view is this. Israel has got to make it clear to everybody that it is not going to leave Gaza until Hamas is destroyed as a political and terrorist threat. And if President Trump does say, hey, we should, strike a deal, then I think Israel is going to have to tell him very clearly, look, with all due respect, this is not the real estate world. There is no deal to be had with these fanatical jihadists. They have got to be uprooted permanently and then backed up by years of security operations. There's no other way. We cannot gamble on our future. If that conversation has to be had, then it has to be had. That's essentially how I see it.
Okay, so here are my thoughts about the same themes. Firstly, anybody who thinks that with ease the Israel Defense Forces is going to be able to go back into the Gaza Strip, specifically into northern Gaza, once the Gazans have returned north, as they have started to do, and they're doing so en masse, I think is very, very detached from the reality. I don't think it will be easy. I don't think it will enjoy the backing of the administration in the United States of America necessarily. I think that challenge is going to be compounded by the release and probably very intense flow of images of destruction from northern Gaza throughout the international media, which is really going to bring information to the consumer that they hitherto did not have. And an administration, an international community able to stand by and support the IDF returning to those areas, I think is not an image that I can readily see. I think that now that the Gazans have returned, the IDF is looking very much, in my opinion, at best at running counter-terror operations inside the Gaza Strip. I don't think you're going to have the mass moving of the population, relocation of the population to safe zones as the IDF redeploys en masse inside the Gaza Strip, inside northern Gaza. I just don't think that is consonant with reality at this time, and therefore
let's pause on that point. Let me just ask you a
yeah,
question. Let's assume that a good chunk, I don't know how many, but a good chunk of the Gazans have nowhere to go back to in northern Gaza, and they
that
may
is the situation, definitely.
right. So I think that in itself is going to put a dampener on how many will go from south to north, how many will leave their established tents. They may be tents, but they're still safe and they have food and they have medical services in Al Mawasi, which is the humanitarian area. I'm not sure how
That's a
many
good point.
are going to
That's a good
move
point.
back north.
Yeah.
Now that's one. Now let's say that some do, right? Some do, and some find that they have homes to go to. I personally don't see any reason why the IDF cannot tell these people to leave once again, once the time comes for them to do so. I don't see any restriction on the IDF doing that. If it has to be done, I think it has to be done. It's already been done all over Gaza. It's been done everywhere. You know this
But we've
as well as I
we've
do.
got a president coming in. So let me give a
Yeah.
couple of counterpoints. Firstly, to your latter point, we have a president coming in who has repeatedly said he wants this over with by the time he takes office. He's taking office tomorrow. He hasn't said, I want this over with for the time being so that I can have a positive inauguration. And afterwards, if you want to bring it back, there's no issue, no problem, no harm, no foul. He hasn't said anything like that. Now, that doesn't mean that he may not say that in the future. Of course, he could say it in the future, but he hasn't said it to this point. His national security advisor, Mike Waltz, has said what you're saying. He has said that Israel will receive the full backing of the American administration in the event that the terms of the deal are not implemented and are not adhered to. But there is very often a disparity between what a national security advisor to a Trump
For sure.
president and what the president of the United States says and thinks and makes the decision to do on a given day. And I don't say that with
Yep.
any respect or disrespect and due respect or disrespect whatsoever. That just is the reality. We've seen it with National Security Advisor John Bolton. We saw it with National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster, and
Yeah.
that is the situation as it is now. The other aspect is when we were operating inside Gaza along the Netzarim corridor, one of the challenges that we had, Yaakov, plays in very well to what you've just said, which was that the IDF wanted the residents of Jabalia and Zaytun in particular to move southward to Al-Mawasi so that we could operate inside Jabalia and Zaytun because Hamas was reconstituting itself and developing a stronghold there. And it
Right.
was a challenge to do so in many of the cases because the Gazans said, now this goes against what you were suggesting. The Gazans were saying to themselves, we have heard rumors that conditions are so bad in Al-Mawasi that we might as well stay here in Jabalia and Zaytun, where the conditions are also so bad, but we don't have to endure this trek down to the tent cities. So do with that as you wish. The fact of the matter is that the Gazans are moving back north. Now, they may move north, see the distraction, say, we've got no reason to remain here, and then start to move southward again. That could certainly happen. But as
Yeah.
things are right now today, the Gazan population is a population to a significant degree that is on the move. And I don't think we can turn our faces away from that. And the direction in which that move is taking place is northward without any question whatsoever. So those are just
Right.
a couple of counterpoints to what you're saying. And I'm going to lean in here and say something that is probably uncomfortable for people to hear. Yaakov, you're talking about the idea of it not making sense for the IDF for Israel rather, to have not realized all of its war games. And I will say, as uncomfortable as it is for me to do so, when it comes to these wars against non-state actors, so Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, Hamas inside the Gaza Strip, as opposed to the state actors that we so effectively fought during the Yom Kippur War, during the Six-Day War. When it comes to these non-state actors, the failure to reach and to stick to the stated war goals is a repeated pattern. That failure is not an anomaly. The failure is a repeated pattern. And it may have taken longer to reach that point on the pattern this time, but I'm very concerned that that is exactly what is going to happen, that which you can't consider as reasonable and rational may yet be that which the Israeli government decides to rest at. And what that leaves me with the fear of is, again, that we are going to be told that we are going to withdraw from the area against the same enemy, the same lack of conclusion, with the same sense that we will be back here in 2 to 3 years hence, as has been the case since 2008 in the case of the Gaza Strip, 2008 and 2009 during Operation Cast Lead, which then begot Operation Pillar of Defense in 2012, which then begot Operation Protective Edge in 2014, and then there were numerous additional rounds, and here we are in Operation Swords of Iron 2023 to the present day. We have not destroyed Hamas. They are still there. They showed us that they are still there in whatever form and with whatever potency. And I believe that you need only a germ of this terror organization, and that germ will mutate and it will increase. And soon enough, they will present themselves as a more potent and dangerous threat than they are today. It may take them some time to return to the form that they were in on October 6th, 2023, the day before they massacred too many Israelis. But I think you're going to see them grow, and I'm deeply, deeply, deeply concerned about that. I'll be very happy if I'm proven wrong. Very, very happy if I'm proven wrong. But when you combine the withdrawal of troops, the presence of Hamas, the pressure of the Americans for us to bring about an end to the conflict not because the conflict is ended, but because the president has said he doesn't want the conflict on his watch. All of that makes for a rather pessimistic picture, in my opinion.
Right. So, in a way, we're kind of talking about two things. One is what we think should happen, and one is what we think will happen. But in my case, I don't envy you because in my case, I believe that what I think should happen will likely happen. Whereas you appear to believe that what you think should happen, there's a very good chance of it not happening. I mean, if I had your suspicions, I would be a lot less easy, let's put it that way. But my suspicion, my belief, and obviously none of us know the future, and I'm not ruling out what you're saying, but my baseline assumption is that the trauma that we have experienced in this country, both at the civilian population level, the military level, and the government level, is so deep, so unprecedented, and so terrible that we will not allow Hamas to retake the Gaza Strip. This is what we're talking about. Will we or won't we? And I think, you hit the nail on the head when you talk about American pressure, because it's interesting. We've heard, and you and I have both agreed with these assessments that the Trump administration is going to be far better for our security than the outgoing Biden administration, which I still hold to be true, by the way. But at the end of the day, and I think I said this in the last podcast, we are not the 51st state. We are not ruled by the White House. We are a sovereign country. Obviously, we are heavily dependent on our superpower ally, the United States, but that does not need to translate into a situation in which we recognize a need to move back into Gaza. Let's simulate a situation in which President Biden uses that word, don't. Let's just simulate that for a moment. But maybe he does it in his own style. And we say, well,
Did you mean President Biden or President Trump when
sorry,
you just
President Trump. I
President
haven't
Trump?
I
Yeah.
haven't updated my Windows yet, but of course
Okay.
I meant President Trump. You're right. I think in that kind of situation, we will simply have to say, unfortunately, Mr. President, with all due respect, we will do what is in our core security interest. And if we don't, then yeah, I agree with you. Then we'll be in serious trouble because the just the reverberation of seeing Hamas retake Gaza, what that will do to the region, as well as to our spirit, to our national spirit, and the questions that it will raise about each and every casualty that we have sustained in this war in Gaza, military casualties, I think it will be intolerable. It will simply be intolerable. And I just can't imagine the government willing to take such a step, which is really borderline sort of self-destructive. I don't see it happening. I've been, I,
Okay.
I do not see it happening, but I don't rule it out completely. I just think it's highly unlikely.
Let me give a couple of counterpoints. And again, Yaakov, I'm not dismissing what you say. Of course, you're absolutely right. Neither one of us knows, but I look at some of the recent developments. So I'll give you just one or two quick thoughts. Firstly, take what took place on the northern border of Israel and the southern border of Lebanon. So we had essentially 60 to 80,000 evacuees, refugees in their own country. I'm referring to the citizens of northern Israel who were moved away from the firing line by Israel to central and southern Israel. And they were moved there until such time we were told this for close to a year that the IDF had either enforced the terms of Resolution 1701 or, in the absence of such a diplomatic resolution, had fought against Hezbollah and established essentially a buffer zone that went from southern Lebanon up to the Litani River. That was what was said and reiterated time and time again by the Prime Minister, by the Defense Minister, by any voice that was speaking with any authority from within Israel. And then came the ceasefire deal that was struck between Israel and Lebanon, and any semblance of any buffer zone had completely fallen by the wayside. Now, the IDF has not withdrawn entirely from southern Lebanon as a consequence of that, but there's still this ridiculous chit-chat about the idea that the Lebanese armed forces, ironically an acronym that spells out the word LAF, that the Lebanese armed forces are going to somehow be arrayed along the area that would have been a buffer zone to prevent Hezbollah from taking up arms in that area. I find that ridiculous on its face. I found it ridiculous on its face at the time. You and I spoke about it. My opinion has not changed. And that's a perfect example of a stated claim, not necessarily a war aim, but a stated claim by the Israeli government that was not followed up with. And I believe that the safety, near and even distant term safety of Israel's citizens in the north of our country is very, very far from being a sure thing, given that, because as I've said many times, and I'm going to say it again here now, you move the civilian population of southern Lebanon close to Israel's border, you are moving Hezbollah close to Israel's border as well, because it's from among that civilian population that they operate, it's from among that civilian population that they recruit, and it's within that civilian population that they establish their terror infrastructure. So learning the lessons of our failure to enforce our own stated goals in the north, I see no reason to doubt that we will make the same mistake in the south, particularly in the light of current events such as the withdrawal, the state's withdrawal of the IDF troops from the Netzarim corridor. So I have very, very little faith in that sense at this particular stage. And I also want to emphasize, Hamas does not have to continue to rule in its guise as Hamas. You know, terror organizations shift shape and form all the time. And if they don't shift shape and form, as quickly as one goes, another one takes its place. We've seen that. So I think that absent the Israel Defense Forces in areas where it is needed, whether it be Hamas or another terror organization, the Gaza Strip is going to be in the hands of terror organizations. And I don't believe that any of those terror organizations are going to be ardent Zionists. And that makes it a very, very dangerous situation. Now, on the point of as not being the 51st state, you are right. And I don't think that anyone will agree with you more stridently than do I on that point. But we've seen, despite Prime Minister Netanyahu's ability to say to an American president, in this case, President Joe Biden, that we appreciate the guidance or don't appreciate the guidance, but we're going to go ahead and defy that guidance and move in a different direction, as was the case when it came to the IDF operating in the area of Rafah in the first place. We've seen that Israel is able to say no, but we've also seen that before us saying no, we can be inhibited, impeded, threatened, even more isolated in the international community, as Joe Biden did when he repeatedly said that we were not permitted, not allowed, would not enjoy American support if we operated inside Rafah. And what that did was it drew out the timeline of this war. And I would argue it's drawn out the timeline of this war to such a degree that a war that President Trump is now saying he wants over would have been over months ago had Israel enjoyed the impunity in the face of an American president's objections that you're now saying it probably does in the face of the incoming American president, Donald Trump. I don't think we've got impunity in any way, shape, or form. I don't think that should be the case. And I thus think that the more swiftly Israel individuates its future on a national security level, in the defense sense, in the abilities of the IDF to operate by itself, regardless of whether it enjoys the support of the world's superpower, the more swiftly that we bring ourselves to true defense independence, the safer we will be, and the greater the friendship we will enjoy with the United States of America, for it will be a friendship of mutual respect rather than dependence and independence.
I couldn't agree more. I've written as much. I've said as much regarding the issue of ammunition, by the way. There are really good steps being made now by the Defense Ministry working with Israeli defense companies to significantly and dramatically boost our independence. This is going to be obviously much more expensive than relying on US aid, but there are factories being opened up here by the three biggest defense companies that will be producing all manner of weapons that really should have been, this should have been the case years ago. But, anything from tank shells to aircraft launched bombs, these are being made in Israel now in ever greater numbers. And that's absolutely critical because, it's like outsourcing your oxygen. You would even to your best friend, you would not give him the ability to decide whether you're going to breathe or not. And that's the analogy here with these weapons. And we saw that, as you've just said, the Biden administration placed selective arms embargoes on the state of Israel, as well as sending over 200 cargo planes with ammunition at the beginning stage of this war. But that very dependence is just a huge vulnerability for us and puts us at the mercy of whoever is sitting in the White House. That cannot continue, and that very much dovetails with what you're saying. So I agree, Benjamin. Listen, we have got to be responsible for our own national security, and that has to come first, because the costs of not behaving in that manner, the costs of allowing others to dictate policy on security to us, is always going to be higher, in my view, than the cost of running up against anybody, the United States, the international community, et cetera, et cetera. If we put our own security interests second to any of those things, we will pay with blood and the very security of our nation. And what could be more important than that? So I am a firm supporter of the idea that Israel has got to put Israel's security interests first, because we are filled with both. We have a room that's filled with both allies and adversaries, and all of them have very good reasons and demands, and some of them are said nicely, and some of them are said in the form of threats about why Israel should not put its own security interests first, why we have 100 and other things to think about, take into consideration, and all of these forces want us not to put our security interests first. I'm sorry to put allies and adversaries in the same room in this case, but the recent experience we've had with the Biden administration has been terrible in my view, really just terrible. And I have no choice but to conclude that it's a matter of life and death, and we have got to be very, very firm on that. So I agree. There's no disagreement with for me about that at all.
Yaakov, two more points before we end this episode. If one had browsed the headlines today, one would likely have stopped at the news that indeed the transfer of the hostages was going to take place for very, very good reasons. But if one looked a little bit deeper in today's headlines, one would have discovered another very, very significant development, which was that the body of Oron Shaul
Yeah.
was recovered from inside the Gaza Strip by way of a military operation to recover that body. And Oron Shaul is one of two soldiers who were killed and kidnapped, and whose remains have been held by Hamas inside the Gaza Strip. Both of these soldiers, the other being Lieutenant Hadar Goldin of blessed memory, both of these soldiers were killed and their remains taken into the Gaza Strip during Operation Protective Edge in 2014. Oron Shaul was a member of the Golani Brigade. I'm just going to read a little bit about that operation for our listeners. And I'm taking this from Times of Israel, where in the coverage states that, quote, in a recent clandestine operation in the Gaza Strip, Israeli troops recovered the body of Staff Sergeant Oron Shaul, who was killed and captured by Hamas in 2014. It goes on that the operation to recover the body was carried out jointly by the IDF and the Shin Bet security agency, with several special forces units, including the Navy's Shayetet Shlosh, that's essentially Israel's equivalent of the US Navy SEALs, and another elite force in the Military Intelligence Directorate. Now, this article states that Shaul's body was brought back to Israel and taken to the Abu Kabir Forensic Institute, where it was identified, and his family was then informed. A couple of thoughts about this, Yaakov. Firstly, tremendous relief that Oron Shaul's body will be laid to rest, his remains will be laid to rest, and the surviving members of his family will be able to mourn in the manner that all families should be entitled to mourn when faced with such a terrible, terrible tragedy. I say surviving members because I believe that his mother actually passed away, if I'm not mistaken. I think his mother
Father, I thought.
father, thank you,
Yeah.
from cancer, if
Right.
I'm not mistaken, during the time that he was being detained. His body was detained by Hamas inside Gaza. Also, it shows that we do not give up on those who have been taken from us. It's just a basic standard in Israel. And I also, of course, hope and pray that Lieutenant Hadar Goldin, who was a young officer in the reconnaissance unit, if memory serves, of the Givati Brigade, an elite unit of the Givati Brigade, that he too, his remains will yet be brought home for burial together with his family from Kfar Saba, with whom we've worked. Several years ago, we worked very closely with his twin brother, Tzor Goldin, and of course with his dear parents, Leah and Simcha. And I'm very hopeful that Hadar Goldin's body will come home for burial. But what struck me about this, Yaakov, is also trying to recall a time when the abduction of one soldier would turn our stomachs inside out, would sicken us, was something that we just did not encounter and react to as in any way acceptable. And look how swiftly our enemies have increased the horror that they bring upon us. We went swiftly from one soldier, two soldiers, such as the two that I've just mentioned, to having 252 people being taken captive on October 7th, 2023.
Yeah, this goes all the way back to Jibril, to the Jibril deal which I think would happen in the 80s, maybe 85, 86. And absolutely, our enemies, are not stupid. They've studied our society. They know the value that we attach to every human life, and they use it against us to go from strength to strength. And that pattern has got to be broken. Absolutely has to be broken. And I think that's completes the circle of what we're talking about, because to me, the way to break that pattern is to eliminate the entity that dared conduct this massacre and this mass kidnapping. That the message going out from this war is that if you kidnap and mass murder and massacre the Jewish people in the land of Israel, you simply will not be around to tell the story afterwards. And that's why I believe that we will move back into the Gaza Strip in one way or another, and we have got to set up a political alternative, which in this stage is us, IDF. I don't see any other way. That's the way to break this terrible cycle. And in the meantime, we haven't had time to discuss this. We are in a perilous moment, not necessarily immediately in Gaza, although we talked about the future dangers, but in Judea and Samaria, the IDF has deployed backup units because a bunch of terrorists are going to be released back to there. And according to the terms of this agreement, if it's seen, all the way to the end, something like 2,000 terrorists are going to be coming out of Israeli prisons, many of them with blood on their hands, many of them dangerous killers who were active in the Second Intifada. And that's going to create a brand new tailwind for terrorism immediately in Judea and Samaria and in other areas as well. So we're definitely, we are dealing with a multi-generational kidnapping cycle and an enemy that knows us very, very well. It's far too easy, I think, to manipulate us. I'm not talking about the actions of our government in one way or the other, but the way society was torn apart by this, the way that we turned on each other as a society, as part of this, crisis, the hostage crisis. That to me is something that we need to learn from and not repeat. Because this is exactly what Hamas wants us to do, is to turn on each other and to stop, seeing it as the main reason why those hostages were languishing away in the Gaza Strip. So this is a huge vulnerability, and it's cultural. It's who we are. It's the DNA of, the cultural DNA of the Jewish people. Our enemy, not stupid, takes full advantage of it time and again. And this is only going to embolden them to try more kidnappings. We have to be honest about that. So this is something that we're going to have to really think about, strategize going forward. By the way, we don't have time now, but there was a commission that was set up to look at this very issue after the Shalit deal. I think it was headed by former Supreme Court Judge Shmagar, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah,
Shamgar, right? And the recommendations there are very different from what we're doing now, obviously. But it's worth revisiting that perhaps in a future podcast, because I think we're going to have to start looking at some policies about this going forward. Otherwise, we're going to be dealing with many more kidnappings.
And the final point, Yaakov, that I wanted to discuss was that everything that we saw today was fought for and sacrificed for by not less than 400 soldiers of the Israel Defense Forces who have fought and laid down their lives during the course of this war. And that is why, when we think about those heroes, when we think about the ultimate sacrifice that so many of them willingly paid and willfully paid, that is why what ends up being the end state inside the Gaza Strip is so very important, because these soldiers are our citizens. These citizens are our soldiers. They are civilians, as Menachem Begin used to describe, who we see with enormous regularity and frequency change from their civilian clothes to the olive green uniform of the Israel Defense Forces, grab hold of a rifle and say, "Give me the tools and I will go and turn this threat back on itself." And so many of them have fallen, so many of them have been lost to us, and they are the reason that our leaders must make decisions with the uppermost wisdom, courage, conviction, and deference and recognition to their sacrifices. They must make those decisions without any contamination of political considerations or considerations for their own political welfare or lifeblood. And I dare say that if you were to ask the combat soldiers who marched into the Gaza Strip whether they were willing to risk it all in order to bring back the 3 women who were released from Hamas captivity today, I think that they would have said one after the other, "Yes, I am. And not only will I tell you that I am, but I'm about to show you that I am by marching forward into the unknown." I really do believe that. I don't think that anybody wishes to pay the ultimate sacrifice, but I believe that there are many, many in Israel who are willing to do so in the pursuits of guaranteeing, safeguarding, and protecting the lives of their fellow Israeli. And that needs to be the ethos that washes throughout the states of Israel, not the ethos of division that you have just said needs to be really banished from our land. And it just would not be appropriate for us to conclude today without saying a word about those 400 soldiers, about the families who have lost that which is dearest to them in the pursuit of bringing home our hostages, 3 more of whom were returned to us today. There remains a very, very long list of hostages yet to be redeemed, and we must not desist from the work required in order to redeem them from the clutches of Hamas inside the Gaza Strip. And so, as ever, Yaakov, I pray for as I say, the safety of our soldiers, the redemption of our hostages, and the wisdom of our policymakers and leaders. And I truly believe that the meeting point of those 3 prayers lies the key to Shalom al Yisrael. And I just wondered, you're someone who's covered these soldiers for so many years. You've reported on these soldiers for so many years. You recently did an embed with some of these soldiers inside the Gaza Strip. I wondered if you had something that you'd like to say in conclusion about those who have sacrificed so very much.
I would just say that in their memory and in their honor, we must not let Hamas take back Gaza, because in order it's I totally agree with you that they all went in there, and one of the things that was on foremost on their mind was, we're fighting to release our people from our hostages and grant them freedom. That was definitely one of the top things on their mind, and it's an incredible people that can provide, produce human beings that are willing to do that and stop everything in the middle of life and go and do that. So there's no question about that. But they also went in there to destroy the jihadist, genocidal force that grew in Gaza. And because they made the ultimate sacrifice, that to me means that the mission has to be completed. Cannot leave this as an incomplete mission. Mission complete means that Hamas is going to be not as an idea. Everybody likes to say you can't destroy the idea with a tank, and that's true, but they must never have the capabilities, and they cannot have a government. No vacuum can be left in Gaza, come what may, whatever the world may have to say about it. We cannot leave behind a vacuum in Gaza for Hamas and its depraved death cult to fill once again. That's what I would say, particularly in the honor of those who fell.
Well, Yaakov, thank you so very much. And again to Romi Gonen, 24, Emily Damari, 28, and Doron Steinbrecher, 31. We thank God for their return home to Israel. We welcome them home to Israel, and we pray that they rest, recuperate, and go from strength to strength as they begin their lives anew. They're embraced by all of us, and all of us celebrate their return to our land. Thank you very much, Yaakov.
Thank you.